I was working late again, pushing through another insurance report that had to be filed by morning. Deadlines were a regular part of the job, and I had grown used to burning the midnight oil at the office. It was routine. I didn't mind it anymore. It was quieter when everyone else had gone home. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the tapping of my keyboard were the only sounds that filled the space. It was just me in the building, or so I thought. The rest of the team had cleared out hours ago, leaving their desks in various states of disarray. A couple of chairs were pulled out, a stack of papers teetering on the edge of a desk, but nothing unusual. The office wasn't too large, just the one floor, and my desk was by the windows overlooking the street. The soft glow of the streetlights filtered in, casting long shadows across the rows of empty cubicles. I glanced at the clock, 11:37 p.m. I should have been tired, but there was an odd energy in the air. Maybe it was the caffeine, maybe just the tension of the looming deadline, but I was on edge. It wasn't until I heard a faint noise, like a soft scrape, that I paused. I froze for a moment, fingers hovering above the keyboard, and strained to listen. Nothing. Silence. I shook it off and resumed typing, telling myself it was just the building settling, or maybe the air conditioning kicking in. But after a few more minutes, there it was again, a soft thud, like something had fallen. I stood up from my desk and took a slow walk toward the hallway that led to the break room. Maybe a book had fallen from one of the shelves, or maybe someone had left a window open. I reached the break room and flicked on the lights. Empty. Not even the faintest sign of disturbance. The vending machine hummed softly in the corner, and the coffee pot was untouched from earlier that afternoon. I turned to go back to my desk, but as I walked through the hallway, the lights above me flickered. For a second, everything went dark. My heart jumped, and I felt that sudden wave of irrational fear crawl up my spine. It was late, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself. Then I heard the elevator ding. I stopped in my tracks. The office was on the 5th floor, and the elevator hadn't been used since the last person left. Slowly, I moved toward it, every step feeling heavier than the last. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the empty cabin stared back at me. There was no one inside. The display above the door showed it had come from the lobby. I backed away, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe security was doing their rounds, or maybe someone had forgotten something and come back to retrieve it. But as I stood there, waiting for something to explain the strange feeling creeping over me, the elevator doors slid shut again, heading back down without anyone calling it. That was when I decided to grab my bag. The report wasn't finished, but I could send it from home. The office had become too unsettling. I hurried back to my desk, shoved my laptop into my bag, and was about to turn off my monitor when I caught a reflection in the screen. A figure, faint but undeniable, standing just a few feet behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but the office was empty. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been there, just for a moment. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that primal sense of being watched. At that point, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I rushed to the elevator, not caring how irrational I might have seemed. The building felt alive, charged with something I couldn't understand. As the doors closed, I glanced back one last time, but nothing. I got home, but the uneasy feeling from the office followed me. I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried. Every shadow in my apartment felt too long, too dark, and my mind kept replaying that moment when I saw the faint figure behind me in the reflection of my monitor. I barely slept, and by morning I was up early, forcing myself to focus on finishing the insurance report. I hit send, relieved to finally be done, but just as I was about to close my laptop, my phone rang. It was my boss, and the tone of her voice immediately sent a chill through me. She started saying that security had notified her earlier that morning. Apparently, the motion sensors in the office had gone off after hours, well after I'd left for the night. She knew I had been working late, so she checked the camera footage to make sure everything was in order. At that moment, The unease that had been lurking at the edge of my mind deepened. She told me that the cameras had captured something odd. After I left the building, the sensors continued detecting movement inside the office. At first, she assumed it was nothing, just the system being overly sensitive. But when she watched the footage, it showed something different. Someone else had been in the office. I felt a tightness in my chest as she explained it. She said that after I had grabbed my things and exited the building, a figure appeared near my desk. Not a person she could identify, just a shadow, someone moving in the background. Whoever it was had been standing in the shadows of the cubicles near the very spot where I'd been working. She admitted that security had tried to figure out who it was, but they couldn't see the person's face. Worse, there was no clear way to tell how they had entered or exited the building. No doors had opened, no elevator called after I'd left. It was as if this person, or whatever it was, had simply appeared. The realization hit me hard. I hadn't been alone in the office. Something had been there the whole time, watching me, waiting. The office, once a place of routine, of deadlines and paperwork, had become something else. Something I didn't want to face anytime soon. All I could do was wonder who had been in there with me. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway with my two best friends, Ryan and Scott. We had booked a secluded Airbnb for a weekend escape from our hectic lives. Nestled in the woods with a beautiful view of the mountains, it was the ideal setting for relaxation and adventure. We spent our days hiking, exploring the nearby lakes, and indulging in endless laughter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves back at the house, drinking and playing poker by the pool. The stars twinkled overhead, casting a serene glow on the water. I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment wash over me. This was everything I had hoped it would be. But as the clock struck 3 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. We had just finished a game and were enjoying a quiet moment in the pool when the faint sound of a car engine broke the stillness of the night. Curious, Scott, ever the inquisitive one, leaned over to catch a glimpse. He whispered with urgency in his voice to come see this. We exchanged nervous glances before swimming closer to the edge. Peering through the bushes separating our Airbnb from the neighboring property, we saw a man standing beside his car, wrestling with a large, heavy bag. The way he pulled it along the ground, grunting with effort, made our hearts race. It was strange enough for a man to be outside at this hour, but the bag he was dragging was alarming. It was dark and ominous, and we could see liquid pooling beneath it. Ryan asked if that was blood, his voice barely above a whisper. My stomach churned as we observed the man, who appeared disheveled, glancing around as if ensuring he was alone. He seemed to struggle to lift the bag into the trunk, his brow furrowed with exertion. Then, without warning, he reached for a hose attached to the side of his house. The sound of rushing water filled the air, and he began spraying down the area where the bag had rested. What kind of person washes away evidence in the middle of the night? We decided to check this out. We quickly got dressed, trying to quiet the pounding of our hearts as we prepared to confront this unknown figure. We kept our voices low, adrenaline coursing through our veins. As we crept around the pool, our breaths shallow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something we didn't fully understand. Feeling emboldened, we decided to investigate further instead of confronting him outright. We moved to a vantage point hidden behind a cluster of trees. The man finished washing the ground and, seemingly agitated, began to pace around his car. We caught snippets of muttered words that sounded like frantic apologies. As we stayed hidden, the situation took a shocking turn. A second car pulled up, and a figure stepped out, a woman, frantic and panicked. She approached the man, and their conversation was a hurried exchange that suggested something deeper and far more sinister than we had initially suspected. No matter which path we choose, the night had taken a turn into the unknown. The carefree vacation we had anticipated had morphed into something far more chilling. The chilling scene unfolded before us. The man, still agitated, exchanged hurried words with the woman. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear, and her hands trembled as she gestured toward the bag. I felt a surge of dread at the implication of their conversation. This wasn't just a random act, something had gone terribly wrong. The woman suddenly turned her gaze toward the house, and I felt my heart stop. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. Thankfully, she turned back to the man, and after a few tense moments, they both hurried to the car. My stomach dropped as they climbed inside, and my instincts kicked in. I whispered urgently that we had to follow them, glancing at Ryan and Scott, who nodded with taut faces filled with determination. We quietly went to my car parked a bit farther away. Once inside, I started the engine, trying to keep the noise to a minimum. As we pulled away from the house, the man's car came into view just ahead, its taillights glowing in the darkness. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, but I focused on the road, keeping a safe distance behind them. Ryan murmured, asking where they were going as he glanced at the GPS. There was nothing out here but woods. Scott replied that they had to be going somewhere, peering out the window. He suggested we just stay on them. The car turned onto a narrow dirt road, and I followed cautiously, trying not to lose sight of them. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees closed in around us, and the moonlight barely pierced through the branches. It felt like we were entering a different world, a world where anything could happen. After several minutes of tense driving, the man's car pulled up to an old, abandoned warehouse. My heart raced as they parked in front, and I killed the engine, the darkness swallowing our vehicle in silence. We waited, unsure of what to do next. I whispered if we should get out and take a look, my voice trembling slightly. Scott replied firmly that we needed to stay put and see what happened first. As we watched, the man and woman exited the car, and I could see their anxious body language as they glanced around the area. The woman fidgeted with her hair, and the man kept glancing back toward the road. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity held me captive. Suddenly, the man pulled out a flashlight from the trunk and shone it toward the warehouse. They stepped inside the warehouse, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. The bag in the trunk seemed to be the key to understanding what was happening. I glanced at Scott and Ryan, both wearing expressions of equal parts fear and intrigue. I suggested we check out the car, my voice barely above a whisper. The trunk was still open, and we needed to see what was inside that bag. Ryan looked hesitant, asking if I was sure, worried about what would happen if they came back. I nodded, adrenaline surging through me. We'd be quick, and if needed, we could duck behind the car. But if we didn't check, we'd always wonder what was in there. Scott's eyes lit up with the thrill of the unknown, and he nodded in agreement. He urged us to be super quiet. We stealthily made our way toward the car, our hearts pounding in unison. I motioned for them to stay low as we approached. We reached the car, and I crouched beside the open trunk, peering inside. I pulled out my phone, switching on the flashlight, and shone it into the trunk. The beam illuminated the contents, and I gasped as I caught sight of dark red stains that looked unmistakably like blood. Just then, we heard the creak of the warehouse door swinging open. The man emerged, his eyes wild with rage. He screamed, demanding what the hell we were doing, his voice echoing in the still night air. Panic surged through me. Scott shouted to run, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We sprinted back to my car, hearts pounding in our chests. As we jumped inside, I fumbled with the keys, finally turning the ignition just as the man charged toward us, his face twisted in fury. He screamed to get back here, but I slammed the gear into drive and peeled away, the tires squealing on the gravel. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man leap into his own car, his headlights flashing on as he took off after us. Scott urged, his voice filled with urgency, that we should just fight him, reasoning it was 3 against 1. Panic creeping into my voice, I shot back, asking if he was insane and what if the guy had a weapon. The last thing I wanted was to engage him in a fight. The fear in my gut told me we had to escape, not confront him. Ryan echoed my concern, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror, saying it was too dangerous. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, praying we could lose him. The dirt road was narrow and winding, but I focused on navigating the twists and turns as the man's car closed in behind us. Ryan shouted, pointing ahead and urging me to take a right. I swerved sharply, tires skidding as we hit the new path. The sound of gravel crunching beneath us masked the roar of the man's engine, but I could still hear him gaining on us. We continued to speed away, and finally, we managed to lose him. As we neared the main road, I spotted the lights of our Airbnb through the trees. I pulled into the driveway and slammed the brakes, the car coming to a screeching halt. Without a second thought, we leaped out and dashed into the house. Our bags were already half-packed from our earlier adventures, and we scrambled to grab whatever we could. Once we had everything, we jumped back into the car and sped away from the Airbnb, heading straight for the nearest police station. When we arrived, we burst into the station, breathless and panicked. We relayed the entire story to the officers on duty, describing the man, the bag, and the blood we had seen. They listened intently, taking notes and assuring us they would investigate the situation. One officer urged us to stay calm, assuring they'd send someone to check it out. After what felt like an eternity, they finally left to check the abandoned warehouse and the neighboring house, promising to keep us informed. We waited nervously in the station, but when they returned, their faces were inscrutable. The officer shook his head and informed us that they hadn't found anything conclusive. They had gone to the abandoned warehouse and the neighboring house, talking to the suspects. Even the man had agreed to open his trunk, but there was nothing suspicious inside. No evidence, no signs of a struggle. Even the neighbors hadn't seen anything unusual. Disappointment settled over us like a heavy fog. I couldn't believe it. We had seen blood, but despite our protests, the officer explained that without concrete evidence, there was nothing they could do. Feeling a mix of frustration and fear, we left the station, unsure of what to make of the night's events. We never returned to that Airbnb or the woods that surrounded it. What had been a fun weekend away had turned into a nightmare, and the memory of that bloodstained bag forever changed us. I've always loved my job. Delivering food, driving through quiet streets at night. It's peaceful, almost calming. It's just me, my music, and the road. My family, though, they worry. Because I am a woman. They constantly remind me, warning that it's too dangerous for someone like me, especially at night. You're too trusting, they'd say. Too attractive. I'd shrug it off, thinking I could handle myself. But that night I learned they were right. It was my last delivery of the evening, and I was ready to call it a night. The order was on the outskirts of town, somewhere I hadn't been before. Still, I didn't think much of it. The directions were straightforward, the streets were quiet, and everything felt normal. But the deeper I drove, the fewer streetlights there were. The houses were spread farther apart, and soon enough, the road was flanked by dense trees, shadows stretching across the pavement. The address appeared on my GPS, and I slowed to a stop in front of a house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Weeds climbed up the walls, the windows were grimy, and parts of the wood were rotting. The porch light flickered weakly, the only sign of life. My stomach twisted. There was no way someone lived here. I glanced at my phone, double-checking the app. Yes, this was the right place. For a second, I thought about turning around and heading back. But then I imagined my boss's disapproving face, and I knew he wouldn't be happy if I returned with the food. I had a job to do. So, I took a deep breath, grabbed the bag, and made my way toward the front door. The air was thick with silence. Not the kind that's peaceful, but the kind that feels wrong, too quiet, like the world's holding its breath. I knocked twice, each tap echoing in the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. The house seemed dead, like no one had set foot in it for years. Then, the door creaked open, just a sliver at first. My heart skipped a beat as an old man stepped into view, his face emerging from the shadows. He was gaunt, his skin pale and papery like it hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. His eyes dark, hollow, locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Food delivery?" I stammered, forcing a smile. He didn't respond at first, just kept staring at me, his eyes dragging slowly from my face down to my feet. Then, without warning, he grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, too strong for someone his age. I tried to pull back, but he held me in place, his fingers digging into my skin. My heart raced, panic surging through me. He leaned in close, his breath warm and foul against my cheek as he rasped. "Come inside. You'll be safe here." His voice was low, almost coaxing, like he was trying to convince me that nothing was wrong. I shook my head, yanking harder against his grip, but he wouldn't let go. His eyes gleamed as he smiled, an unnatural, twisted smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "If you don't come in now, my son will come for you. You won't want to lose something so perfect." These words hit me like ice. I yanked free, stumbling back a few steps. My hands were shaking as I turned and ran to my car, barely registering the sound of the door creaking shut behind me. When I finally got the car started, I tore down the driveway, my heart still hammering in my chest. But just as I was beginning to think I'd escaped, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw it. A car, its headlights off, creeping out from behind the house. My blood ran cold. It was following me. I slammed on the gas, swerving through the narrow streets, trying to lose them. Every turn I made, they followed, their car lurking in the shadows. I didn't know what to do. All I could think was that I needed to get back to the restaurant. Back to somewhere safe. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, I stumbled out of the car and rushed into the back office, breathless and shaking. My boss looked up from his desk, his face growing serious as I babbled about the old man, about the car following me. He listened carefully, and without hesitation, he picked up the phone and called the police. He told me to take the rest of the night off, that I needed to calm down. The police, he assured me, would check out the house. Back at my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I tried to tell myself it was over. The police were handling it. I was safe. But every little sound made me jump, my nerves frayed from the encounter. I put on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out the thoughts racing in my head. Not long after my phone rang, it was my boss again. His voice was tense as he explained that the police had gone to the address but hadn't found anyone there. The house, they said, was known to be squatted by various people, but it was empty when they arrived. He said there wasn't much the police could do at the moment. That's when I felt the panic start to set in again. If they hadn't found anyone, it meant those men, whoever they were still out there. I tried to focus on something else, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the window. Every shadow felt like it was moving. Every creak of the building sent my heart racing. Then, I heard the sound of my bedroom window sliding open. My blood turned to ice. I froze, barely breathing, listening as the window creaked wider. Someone was inside. My first instinct was to check it out, but something in me knew that would be a mistake. If I went into that room, I might not make it back out. I needed to leave, and fast. I crept toward the front door, my hands shaking as I unlocked it as quietly as I could. I pulled it open a crack, and that's when I saw him. The old man stood in the hallway, his twisted smile wider than ever. He stared at me, his eyes gleaming as he said, in that same raspy voice, "I told you my son would come for you." I felt my stomach drop, and I slowly turned my head. Behind me, just inside my apartment, was the younger man. Taller, stronger, his face just as hollow as his father's. His eyes locked onto me, and I knew I was trapped. There was only one way out, the terrace. I lived on the second floor, high enough that jumping could mean serious injury. I knew I didn't have time to make it down the emergency staircase, and staying meant certain doom. My heart pounded in my chest as I made the split-second decision to run. I bolted for the terrace, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Behind me, I heard the younger man's footsteps, heavy and fast, closing in on me. Just as I reached the railing, I felt his hand graze my arm, his fingers brushing my skin. But I didn't stop. I vaulted over the edge, my body free-falling through the air. The world blurred around me. I hit the ground hard. Pain exploded through my leg as I felt it snap beneath me, and my wrist twisted unnaturally as I landed. The agony was blinding, but I didn't care. I was alive. I had to be alive. I screamed for help, my voice hoarse and desperate. The pain made it hard to focus, But through the fog of agony, I saw flashing lights. Police. By some miracle, they were there. They rushed to me, pulling me to safety. Between gasps, I explained everything. The old man, his son, how they had followed me. The officers didn't waste any time. They stormed up into my building, weapons drawn, ready to arrest the men who had tried to trap me. I watched through a haze of pain as they disappeared inside. As the paramedics lifted me onto the stretcher, I couldn't shake the fear clinging to me. I had survived, but I knew I'd never forget the cold, hollow eyes of those men, or how close I had come to never making it out alive. It was late, past midnight, and I was driving home after a party. The 80s had a way of making nights feel longer. No cell phones, no GPS, just me and my old Chevy in the dark, empty highway stretching ahead. My boyfriend Zach couldn't make it to the party because of work, so it was just me and the road. The radio hummed low, playing a static-filled rock station as I drove. The car headlights cut through the thick darkness, and I had the strange, lonely sensation of being the only person for miles. Then, without warning, my car began to sputter. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine gave out completely. The Chevy coasted to a stop on the side of the road, dead. I stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the cool night air, and popped the hood, hoping it was a simple fix. But I didn't really know anything about cars, and it was clear after a few minutes that this wasn't something I could solve on my own. I needed to find a phone booth to call Zach. There was nothing else I could do. I started walking down the road, the night so still that the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. The road stretched endlessly before me, bordered by dense woods on either side. The farther I walked, the more isolated I felt. After about 20 minutes, I started to hear something. Footsteps. They were faint at first, barely noticeable, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. They were close, and they matched my pace. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I turned, peering into the darkness behind me, but the road was empty. I stood there for a moment, my pulse quickening, but saw nothing. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I continued walking, though my heart was racing now. Then I heard it again, those same footsteps, a little faster this time. I whipped around, and that's when I saw him. A man standing a short distance behind me, watching me. He wasn't close enough for me to see his face, but I could tell he was staring straight at me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the shadows of the road. My chest tightened. I thought about calling out for help, but something in me said not to. His silence, his stillness, it was all wrong. I turned back around and started walking faster. But I could hear him. He was following me. My feet moved quicker, my pace turning into a jog, but so did his footsteps. Panic surged through me. I didn't dare look back again. I started running. I sprinted down the road, my heart pounding, my breath sharp in the cold night air. The sound of his footsteps behind me was steady, relentless. I darted into the woods, crashing through the underbrush, hoping to lose him. The branches scratched at my arms and face, but I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs growing weak. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled out of the trees and into the edge of a small town. The streets were quiet, empty. The faint glow of a few streetlights was the only sign of life. I stopped, panting, scanning the tree line behind me. He wasn't there. Somehow, I had lost him. I hurried into the town, looking for a phone. My mind raced with a mix of fear and relief. I had made it here, but what if he followed? I found a small convenience store still open, and inside, near the back, there was a payphone. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the change, dialing Zach's number. I could barely breathe as the phone rang, waiting for him to pick up. When Zach answered, I tried to explain everything. How the car broke down, how I had been followed, and how I was in some small town off the highway. He told me he'd come right away, and I hung up the phone, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. I waited by the window, trying to calm myself, but the fear lingered. The clerk in the store didn't seem to notice my nerves as I paced, glancing at the quiet street outside. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for Zach. Each time the door of the store jingled, I jumped, half expecting the man to walk through. Then, as if out of a nightmare, he did. The door creaked open, and there he was. The man from the road. He stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me, his expression unreadable. The fear that had been simmering inside me all night exploded into full-blown panic. He hadn't stopped. He had followed me all the way to the town. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as I edged toward the back of the store, toward the exit. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. My breath came in shallow gasps, and without thinking, I turned and ran out the back door. I burst into the alley behind the store, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I ran blindly, not knowing where I was going, but I had to get away. The narrow alley was lined with dumpsters and the occasional back door to a closed shop, and I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady and unhurried. Just when I thought I was out of options, I saw headlights coming down the road. Zach's car screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley, and I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward the car, my heart racing, and threw myself into the passenger seat as Zach jumped out to meet me. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. I could see the worry in Zach's eyes as he looked at me, then at the alley behind me. He got back into the driver's seat, and we sped off, leaving the small town behind us. I glanced back one last time, expecting to see the man standing there, but the alley was empty. The streets were quiet again, as if nothing had happened. We drove in silence, the tension still thick between us as Zach kept his eyes on the road. As we left the dark roads behind, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My mind raced, replaying the night over and over, but I couldn't make sense of it. Who was that man? Why had he followed me? And what would have happened if Zach hadn't shown up when he did? The first light of dawn began to break over the horizon as we neared home. I felt exhausted, drained, but safe with Zach beside me. Whatever that man's intentions had been, they didn't matter anymore. I was home. If you've enjoyed these true scary stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you won't miss out anything. And let me know in the comments below which story was your favorite. Thanks for watching, and stay spooky. The Reaper's not done with you yet.